Hello and welcome to Feed Your Faith, or welcome back. In this segment we're going to be looking at those verses in Philippians chapter 2 from verses 5 to 11. I don't know about you, but do you ever find yourself being persecuted by an earworm? A little piece of music or a jingle or a phrase that just goes round and round and round and round in your head, and no matter how you try to get rid of it, you just can't shift it. In fact, for me, the act of trying sometimes makes it even worse. Now, psychologists who study this tell us an earworm is merely a triggered involuntary memory, and it's usually music, although it can be a poem or a jingle or a phrase that's just become embedded in our minds. Well, now, these verses in Philippians are an earworm for me. Every time I'm thinking or writing or speaking about the person of Jesus Christ, these verses replay themselves in my mind like a persistent earworm, a sort of biblical earworm. And that's partly because verses 5 to 11 say so much about Jesus, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first of all, let's ask, what is verses 5 to 11? Because when we look at the original text, we can see that this little block sort of stands out as a unit all by itself. Now, the current consensus is that it's probably a hymn or a piece of liturgy or a poem that was used in the early church. Now, bearing in mind that only a fortunate few were able to read and write in the first century, teaching truth by songs and poems and aphorisms which are easy to remember was a good way of getting the gospel across, especially to new believers. And that's where this kind of passage fits in. So maybe it was intended to be an earworm all along. And if it was, it still works, at least for me it does. Now, so far, Paul has been urging humility on us as the key to oneness and the key to building the church and building the kingdom. So how could he expect people to develop such a quality? His answer is as simple as it is profound. Let's imitate Jesus. Look at verse 5. Have the same mindset as that of Jesus Christ. Incidentally, it's really interesting to spot here how doctrinal statements arise out of practical needs, not the other way round. Now, to be effective, imitation needs an adequate pattern, and Paul can think of no better pattern than Jesus Christ himself. Living humbly is at the heart of the Christian message, and it shows what Jesus is like to the world around us. Christ is the unique fulfillment of the demand of verse 4 to avoid self-seeking and conceit. So we'll look first at Jesus' disregard for himself and then his great regard for others, although the second part will lead to another segment. So where did Christ start? Well, let's think about his rightful status. There is a high view of Christ here. He's in the form of, or in the very nature of, God. Now, there's a lot of academic discussion over the precise meaning of this. Please get into it if you want to, but some idea of equality with God is undeniable. Jesus perfectly showed what God is like. So when he came, he was like God in a body. And yet he did not see equality with God as something to be clung onto or grasped. If he really was equal with God, he had no need to cling on to it. He did not, in fact, assert his right. That would have been conceit or vainglory. And then we see his self-limitation. Now, it's important to notice the voluntary nature of this. He emptied himself. Whatever else this meant, it certainly shows that becoming a man involved restrictions for Christ. It is the very opposite of self-seeking. And he took on the very nature of a servant. There was a dramatic change of form for him. This was the lowest form of living, a servant comparable with that of a slave. And so his personal transformation was extraordinary, from God to human. It highlights Christ's amazing condescension. He was found in appearance as a man. The true humanity of Jesus is implied by his servant role. Christ accepted not just the human role, but a servant's role. And Paul stresses it here to provide a perfect example for us. Jesus moved from the important to the insignificant. He humbled himself. And this shows the special relevance of Christ's example. This is humility par excellence. And it was voluntary. It wasn't imposed on him by an authoritarian God the Father. Jesus chose it for the sake of you and me. And then we read about his act of dying. And there is a paradox here. If Jesus is in any way divine or like God, and I believe he is, how come he died? Well, Paul puts it like this. He became obedient to death, as if he willingly put himself in the place where death could be his master. And in doing that, he identified with us. Becoming a human being inevitably meant Jesus would eventually go to his death. Otherwise, he wouldn't be truly human. And we are all terminal cases. Jesus voluntarily shared that terminal status with us. And as if that wasn't enough, he died as the lowest of the low. Even death on a cross, says Paul. This was the most ignominious death anyone could be subjected to. Crucifixion was the death reserved for the worst criminals, whose naked bodies were strung up, usually beside the side of the road, to be a chilling example for everyone, including children, as they walked past. The body was then no longer treated as a man, but as a piece of litter, and it was dumped on the local garbage heap. I'm sure we can now see how at every step of this song, Jesus is going lower and lower and lower and lower. It is the ultimate pattern of humility. And no Christian will ever have a greater model of humble living than our Master. Christ achieved his purpose in a way totally opposed to the self-striving of the world. His method is a pattern for us. God bless you. Well, from here you can like, you can subscribe, and you can click elsewhere to see some more videos from this channel that I hope will feed your faith.